It was a mild afternoon in early September when the 3:15 from Paddington pulled into the tiny station of Little Daring. The air smelled faintly of honeysuckle and coal smoke, and the sound of a distant church bell mingled with the chatter of sparrows nesting under the eaves. For most of the village, it was a perfectly ordinary day, except for the stranger who stepped off the train. Where are you listening from tonight? Tell us in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe because we share new Miss Marple mysteries every week. Now settle in. The kettle's on and a strange guest has just arrived at the Swan Inn. He was a man of about 50, neatly dressed in a brown traveling coat. His manner precise yet somehow uncertain, as though every gesture had been rehearsed. He carried a single leather valise, much scuffed at the corners, and asked the station master, Mr. Pike, who knew everyone in the parish, whether there was a decent inn nearby. "The Swan, sir," Pike said, tipping his cap. "Half a mile down the lane, past the churchyard. You'll not miss it." The man nodded with the briefest of smiles. "Thank you. I prefer quiet places," and indeed, the Swan was quiet. A low-beamed country inn with a thatched roof, a smell of oak polish and old ale, and a landlady who took pride in her spotless brass. Mrs. Edith Weatherby had managed the place since her husband's passing, and was known for her discretion. Guests came and went. She remembered their faces, but never their gossip. That evening, as the lamps were lit and the rain began to fall in gentle sheets, Mrs. Weatherby was surprised to find the stranger still in the small parlor, seated by the fire with a newspaper unopened before him. "You'll be wanting supper, sir?" she asked. He started slightly as though roused from deep thought. "Yes, thank you. Just something simple." Later, when she cleared the tray, he was writing in a small notebook, the sort of thing clerks or accountants use. He closed it quickly when she entered. She noticed, however, the faint scent of cigar smoke on his coat and, peculiarly, a smudge of chalk on his sleeve. "Will you be staying long, sir?" "A few nights, perhaps, and that was that." His name, as signed in the register, was Mr. Simon Alderney. The next morning, Miss Marple happened to pass the Swan while walking to the vicarage. She was in Little Daring on a short visit. Her dear friend, Mrs. Caroline Bartlett, had written to say that her niece's wedding preparations were quite in disarray. "And Jane, my dear, I simply must have your sensible advice before I lose my mind altogether." So Miss Marple had come, her hat perfectly pinned, her eyes bright and alert beneath its brim. She always said that villages were rather like families. Every smile hid a story, every courtesy a calculation. She noticed at once that the inn's curtains were still drawn, though it was well past 8. A curious thing for Mrs. Weatherby, who was as punctual as the post. When Miss Marple entered, the landlady herself appeared rather pale. "Oh, Miss Marple, you've not heard? How dreadful?" "My dear Mrs. Weatherby," said Miss Marple in her kindly, precise voice, what is dreadful?" "It's Mr. Alderney, the gentleman who arrived yesterday. He's not in his room. His bed was never slept in. And his valise, gone." "Gone?" "Yes, and the window wide open. But he left his coat hanging on the peg, and his notebook upon the table." Miss Marple's gaze shifted toward the narrow staircase that led to the guest rooms. "Dear me," she murmured. "That sounds most peculiar. I do hope nothing unfortunate has occurred." By midday, the entire village knew that a mysterious guest had vanished from the Swan without paying his bill or collecting his belongings. At the post office, speculation ran wild. Mrs. Pike was certain it was suicide. Men in despair often chose lonely inns. The butcher's wife insisted he must have eloped with one of those modern London women. And young Tom Bartlett, delivering telegrams, swore he'd seen someone matching Mr. Alderney's description near the river just before dawn. But by the second day, when no one matching that description was found, and the police reported that no train ticket had been purchased from the station, the whispers took a darker tone, and then came the discovery. It was a farmhand, trudging home through the mist near the old mill pond, who found the hat first, floating among the reeds, damp but unmistakable. Inside the lining, embroidered in neat thread, were the initials S.A. That evening, Miss Marple sat by the hearth at Mrs. Bartlett's cottage, her knitting needles clinking softly. The radio murmured faintly in the background, but her attention was elsewhere. "Do you know," she said thoughtfully, "I remember once, many years ago, a certain Mr. Pritchard who disappeared from the King's Head in Much Benham. It turned out he'd taken the night train to Liverpool, after posting a letter that caused quite a scandal. People rarely vanish without purpose, you see. They may wish to hide, or they may be hidden by others. Mrs. Bartlett shivered. You mean murdered? Miss Marple smiled faintly, her eyes on the fire. Oh, I should never suggest such a thing without cause. But one must admit, my dear Caroline, it is very odd for a man to leave behind his coat in September. And in that quiet sitting room, as the wind rattled the shutters, the first threads of the mystery began to knit themselves together in Miss Marple's mind. By the following morning, Little Daring was buzzing like a disturbed beehive. News of the vanished gentleman at the Swan had traveled from the inn to the greengrocer's, then to the vicarage, and finally into every corner of the parish. Nothing stirred the English countryside quite like a whiff of mystery. The milkman, Mr. Pottle, swore blind he'd seen a man of exactly that description walking toward the woods around 10 that night. The laundress said she'd heard voices near the old well, though she couldn't be sure if it was before or after midnight. And the postmistress, Mrs. Dobbins, had it on excellent authority that a letter addressed to Mr. Simon Alderney had been delivered 2 days before his arrival. Postmarked London, at the Swan, Mrs. Weatherby tried valiantly to maintain order. There'll be no idle chatter in my parlor, she declared to the cluster of curious villagers pretending to drop by for tea. But her own nerves betrayed her. She had barely slept since the discovery of the hat, and now the police had taken Mr. Alderney's notebook for examination. The constable, a well-meaning but easily flustered man named Sergeant Finch, had read the first page aloud before the assembled crowd, thinking it might shed some light. To meet a Daring as arranged. The key to be left in the usual place. Say that one note, brief, cryptic, and unsigned by any recipient, was enough to set off a frenzy of speculation. At 11 o'clock, Miss Marple arrived quietly at the inn. She carried her knitting bag and wore the same light blue coat she'd had for years, the one that made her look quite as harmless as a dove. Sergeant Finch greeted her with visible relief. Morning, Miss Marple. Nasty business, this, but I dare say it's all quite ordinary in the end. A man running from debts or a rendezvous gone wrong. Indeed, said Miss Marple mildly, her eyes glancing toward the writing desk in the corner. Though one does wonder what sort of man travels all the way from London, takes a room, then disappears before even using the bed. Perhaps he took ill and wandered off in a confusion. Finch offered. She said. That's possible, of course. Yet he was methodical enough to bring a notebook and to lock his door from the inside. The sergeant blinked. Locked from the inside? Mrs. Weatherby, wringing her hands, nodded. Yes, I had to fetch the spare key, you see. It was locked proper. I thought he might still be inside. Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted ever so slightly. Then the window must have been his exit. How curious. Men of his age don't usually take to climbing out of upper windows unless they must. By noon, a small gathering had formed in the vicarage garden. Mrs. Dobbins, Mrs. Pike, Caroline Bartlett, and Miss Marple, who sat quietly amongst them, knitting a particularly tricky cable stitch. I tell you, Mrs. Dobbins said, it's a love affair, plain and simple. He came to meet a woman and she turned him down, or perhaps her husband found out. Caroline shook her head. He looked too serious for romance. More like a man on business. Ah, but business can lead to worse trouble than love, said Miss Marple softly. Sometimes both come together and the result is, well, unfortunate. Mrs. Pike leaned forward eagerly. Do you think he's dead, Miss Marple? Miss Marple looked up with mild surprise. My dear Mrs. Pike, why should you assume that? People often vanish for reasons that are not fatal. But I do find it strange that his valise has not been found, nor anything to suggest he left on foot or by vehicle. A man's luggage usually tells his story, and this one seems to have taken his with him except his coat. The group fell silent at that, though the breeze carried the scent of lavender and damp earth. Somewhere nearby a bee buzzed against the window pane. That evening, as dusk fell, the constable returned to the inn with new information. A clerk from the railway office had confirmed that Mr. Simon Alderney did indeed exist, or rather had existed. A man of that name was employed by the Imperial Bank in London, but had died 6 months earlier. A confirmed suicide in his Bloomsbury flat. The inn fell silent. Mrs. Weatherby gasped. Then who was my guest? Miss Marple closed her knitting bag very gently, her fingers still. That, she said softly, is precisely the question we must ask. Someone has gone to the trouble of borrowing the name of a dead man. She paused, her eyes far away. "And in my experience, Sergeant Finch, people only do that when they wish to disappear, or when they are about to commit something rather dreadful." Rain fell steadily over Little Daring the next morning, a fine silvery drizzle that turned the cobbles slick and painted the hedgerows with glistening drops. The village seemed hushed under it, as though the very air were holding its breath. At the Swan, Sergeant Finch had returned with a detective inspector from the county. Inspector Lyle, a tall, brisk man with a clipped mustache and the air of someone who found the countryside irritatingly slow. He had already inspected Mr. Alderne's room, taken statements, and sent for a search of the mill pond where the hat had been found. To him it was all routine. A man assumed a false identity, met someone in secret, and vanished, likely drowned. But Miss Marple, seated quietly in the corner of the parlor, saw something quite different. It wasn't the room itself, sparse, ordinary, impersonal, that intrigued her. It was the little things left behind. The ink blot on the desk that hadn't been wiped, the empty teacup on the nightstand, though Mrs. Weatherby swore she'd served none after supper, the faint scent of carbolic soap, sharp and clinical, clinging to the air. Such details, unremarkable to most, formed a tapestry in Miss Marple's mind, threads of human habit and inconsistency. "Now then, madam," said Inspector Lyle, "you were staying here last night, yes? And you heard nothing unusual?" Mrs. Weatherby shook her head vigorously. "Not a sound, sir, except the rain. It started around 11 and I locked up at past. I always do." "And the key to the guest room, he had it on his person?" "No, sir. Still in the lock when I found the door shut this morning." Miss Marple looked up. "Then someone must have returned it after he left, or wished it to appear so." The inspector gave her a polite, distracted smile. "Quite so, madam." But Sergeant Finch frowned. "You think someone entered after he'd gone, Miss Marple?" "I think," she said mildly, "that human nature is very untidy, Sergeant. When things look too neatly arranged, they generally are." Later that afternoon, Miss Marple took her customary walk, ostensibly to clear her head, though in truth to observe the rhythm of the village. She stopped first at the post office, where Mrs. Dobbins eagerly showed her the ledger. There it is, plain as daylight. The letter that came for him, posted from London 2 days before he arrived. But look, no return address. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles. And you recall who delivered it?" "Tom Bartlett, the vicar's nephew. Bright lad, though easily distracted. You'll find him at the stables now, helping his uncle's groom." Miss Marple thanked her, and by tea-time she had indeed found young Tom, a freckled, eager boy of 16. "Yes, ma'am, I remember the letter," he said earnestly. "Thick envelope, good paper." "I gave it to Mrs. Weatherby, and she passed it to the gentleman herself." He opened it right there in the parlor, looked surprised he did. Pale as milk. "Did he say anything?" Tom frowned in concentration. Just muttered something like, "It's not possible," and went upstairs. "I thought maybe it was bad news." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "You're very observant, Thomas. Never underestimate the usefulness of noticing what people say when they think no one is listening." That evening, she dined quietly with her friend Caroline Bartlett at the vicarage. The talk, of course, was all of Mr. Alderney, or whoever he had been. Caroline was fretful. The inspector's made up his mind. He says the man was a fraud. Probably came to blackmail someone. Though who in Little Daring could he possibly blackmail? Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully. "Oh, my dear, you'd be surprised. There's no village in England without a secret or two. People are much the same everywhere, only their settings change." Caroline sighed. "But it's so dreadful. Imagine staying at an inn under a false name, then vanishing like a ghost." "Ghosts rarely carry notebooks," Miss Marple said with a faint smile. "Speaking of which, did you notice what wasn't mentioned in that notebook?" Caroline blinked. "What do you mean?" The inspector said the first line read, "To meet at Daring as arranged. The key to be left in the usual place." But there was no signature, no date, and no other writing. Don't you find that peculiar? If it were his notebook, surely there would be something else, figures, notes, anything. It's as though the rest had been torn out. Caroline's eyes widened. "You mean someone tampered with it?" Miss Marple smiled gently, setting down her cup. "Or replaced it entirely. There's a certain type of person, my dear, who tidies away the truth rather too neatly." That night, a development came from the search at the mill pond. Sergeant Finch arrived breathless at the vicarage door, his boots dripping rain. "They've found something, Miss Marple." a wallet buried in the mud about 10 yards from where the hat was, and inside were 10 pounds in notes and a railway return ticket. London to Little Daring. Miss Marple's needles paused mid-stitch. A return ticket, Sergeant? Then he meant to go back, that's right. Ma'am? Then I think, she said softly, her eyes glinting, we may safely assume someone else decided he should stay. By the following morning, the entire village of Little Daring had divided neatly into camps of suspicion. Some whispered it was Mrs. Weatherby herself. After all, she alone had access to the spare key. Others thought it must be young Tom Bartlett who'd handled the mysterious letter. And a few, including the postmistress, hinted darkly at the vicar because, as everyone knows, a man of the cloth must surely be hiding something to seem so very good. Miss Marple, meanwhile, sat in Mrs. Bartlett's conservatory, knitting with delicate precision. The rain had stopped, leaving the garden fresh and dripping, and a faint smell of damp roses drifted through the open window. Caroline Bartlett had just returned from the grocer's, bursting with the latest gossip. They're saying Mrs. Weatherby's been seeing someone, she began breathlessly. A man who visits from the next parish and a Mr. Harding, a solicitor or something. They think the stranger might have had something to do with that. Miss Marple didn't look up from her knitting. Mrs. Weatherby is a sensible woman. I shouldn't think she'd risk her reputation for the company of a solicitor. But you must admit, said Caroline, if she were involved with someone, it might explain why she was so nervous that morning. She could have been hiding something. Perhaps, said Miss Marple, looping her yarn with calm precision. Though I've found nervousness often comes from guilt only indirectly. One feels guilty not for what one has done, but for what one knows. That afternoon, Inspector Lyle summoned Mrs. Weatherby to the parlor of the Swan. Miss Marple, under the pretext of returning a forgotten handkerchief, happened to be nearby. Mrs. Weatherby looked strained, her eyes red from lack of sleep. Mrs. Weatherby, said Lyle, I understand you received a letter addressed to this Mr. Alderney before he arrived. Did you read it? Certainly not, sir, she exclaimed, scandalized. I would never do such a thing. But you saw him open it? Yes, and he looked, well, upset. I thought perhaps it was bad family news. Did he go out afterward? He stepped into the garden for some air, but returned not 10 minutes later. He asked me where the telephone was, and then she hesitated. Then he said it was out of order. But it wasn't, sir. I used it not half an hour before. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. The telephone, she repeated softly. Did you hear him speaking to anyone? No, Miss Marple, not a word. Just silence, as though he were listening. Inspector Lyle leaned back in his chair. So either the line was dead or he was pretending to use it, or someone on the other end hung up, said Miss Marple quietly. Later that day, the inspector turned his attention to Mr. Harding, the supposed solicitor. He was a neat, well-fed man in his early 40s, with the confident smile of someone used to being both listened to and believed. Yes, I've known Mrs. Weatherby for years, he said smoothly when questioned at his office. A fine woman, a bit high-strung since her husband's passing. But if you're implying anything improper, well, that's absurd. Inspector Lyle flipped open his notebook. You were seen visiting the Swan 3 nights before Mr. Alderney arrived. Strictly business, Harding said quickly. Mrs. Weatherby wanted advice about a small inheritance. And the man calling himself Mr. Alderney? Harding frowned, feigning thought. Never met him. Though I did hear of the disappearance. Strange business, but I suppose some people simply run away. Miss Marple, who had accompanied the inspector as a witness to the questioning, smiled gently. Yes, indeed. But I do wonder, Mr. Harding, why would a man who intends to run away purchase a return ticket? The solicitor's composure faltered for just a second. Then he recovered with a laugh that was slightly too forced. You can't expect logic from people who vanish, Miss Marple. No, she said mildly. But one can often expect patterns. People rarely act out of character. A dishonest man will always tell his lie the same way, too neatly, as though rehearsed. That evening after supper, Miss Marple sat with Sergeant Finch in the parlor of the Swan, the lamp throwing long shadows across the floral wallpaper. You don't believe it was Mrs. Weatherby, do you, ma'am? He asked hesitantly. No, Sergeant. She's frightened, not guilty. Frightened women tremble at shadows, but guilty ones try to rearrange them. Then Harding? Possibly. But there's something missing, a motive, perhaps. Money, revenge, or a secret. One doesn't take another man's name and travel to a country inn for nothing. Could it be blackmail? Miss Marple's knitting paused. Ah, now that is a very human motive, and it fits quite well with the curious note about the key in the usual place. Keys are most inconvenient things, Sergeant. They open more than doors. They open secrets. The next morning brought the story's first sharp twist. A gardener cutting back ivy near the stables found something glinting in the soil. It was a small brass key, tarnished but clearly marked with an engraved numeral. 3. When shown to Mrs. Weatherby, she paled visibly. "That's one of ours," she whispered. "The spare for room 3, Mr. Alderney's room. But I keep all the spares in a locked drawer." "And the drawer?" asked Miss Marple. Mrs. Weatherby swallowed. "It was open this morning." Miss Marple stood by the window, looking out toward the mist-covered lane. Her expression was calm, but her mind was racing. A missing guest. A false name. A return ticket. A key left where it should not be. All threads in a tapestry she was beginning to see. Someone, she thought, had been waiting for Mr. Simon Alderney. Or rather, for the man pretending to be him. And that someone had made sure he would never check out. The following day dawned clear and pale, with a watery sunlight that cast long shadows across the cobbled street. Little Daring, for all its gossip and murmurs, appeared once more a picture of English serenity. The baker's boy whistled as he carried his tray. Mrs. Pike was scrubbing her steps, and the church bell marked 9 with calm regularity. But beneath the calm, the village hummed with unease. The police search of the surrounding fields had yielded nothing further. The mysterious wallet, the hat, and the brass key were all that remained of Mr. Simon Alderney, except, of course, for his notebook. Inspector Lyle had nearly dismissed it. A few cryptic scrawls, hardly evidence, but Miss Marple had asked ever so politely whether she might glance at it once more before it was sent off to the station in Brenton. If you think you know who's behind this, pause right here and drop your guess in the comments. Let's see how many of you can outsmart Miss Marple. It was late morning when Sergeant Finch, under orders to humor her, arrived at Mrs. Bartlett's cottage with the notebook in hand. "Mind you don't smudge it, ma'am," he said. "The inspector doesn't hold much stock in it, but I dare say you'll see more than I can." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "One mustn't underestimate the value of handwriting, Sergeant. It tells one so much about a person, far more than they ever intend." She opened the small brown book upon the breakfast table. The first page was as before, to meet at Daring as arranged. The key to be left in the usual place. But what caught her attention this time was not the words themselves, but the impression faintly visible on the next page, ghostly marks left by a pen pressing too hard. She tilted the page toward the window light and squinted. There, barely legible, she could make out a few scattered words. Told her everything. Not safe. The ledger. Her knitting lay forgotten beside her. "The ledger," she murmured. "How very interesting." That afternoon she visited the Swan once again. Mrs. Weatherby, looking somewhat steadier now, was behind the bar polishing glasses. "My dear," said Miss Marple kindly, "I wonder if you might indulge my curiosity. I hear that a certain Mr. Harding, the solicitor, was advising you about an inheritance." Mrs. Weatherby flushed slightly. "Yes, Miss Marple. My late husband's cousin passed away. There was a small bequest, but Mr. Harding said the accounts were complicated. I trusted him to sort it out. I'm sure you did. Solicitors are such useful people. But I understand he had occasion to visit you here rather late one evening." "Yes," said Mrs. Weatherby nervously. "He brought some papers I needed to sign. Though now that I think on it, he seemed in an awful hurry." "Indeed. And afterward?" "He left through the back door. I remember because I heard a car just after he went. But it..." She hesitated. "Mr. Alderney arrived only a few days later." Miss Marple smiled pleasantly. "Life is full of coincidences, Mrs. Weatherby, though some, I find, are rather too convenient." On her way out, Miss Marple paused by the reception desk, running a finger along the wooden surface. The register book lay open, neat as a church ledger, each guest's name and date carefully written. She flipped back a few pages. 2 weeks prior, the same handwriting had entered another name. Mr. H. Brown, room 3, room 3 again. "Tell me, Mrs. Weatherby," she asked, "do you recall this Mr. Brown?" "Vaguely," said the landlady. "He stayed only one night. Quiet man, middle-aged, asked for no meals, paid in cash. Did he leave anything behind? Mrs. Weatherby frowned. A broken fountain pen, I think. I threw it out. Miss Marple's smile deepened just slightly. Ah, how careless of him, and how convenient for someone else. That evening she sat once more with Sergeant Finch at the vicarage. He had grown accustomed to her manner by now, the way her mild questions turned with surprising sharpness toward the very heart of things. You think the man who called himself Mr. Alderney was really this Mr. Brown? He asked. I think, said Miss Marple thoughtfully, that both names were borrowed. One man traveling under two false identities is already a puzzle. But when two different men use the same room, both under assumed names, and one ends up vanished, it becomes rather more than that. Finch scratched his head. But why go to all that trouble? Ah, that's the question, isn't it? Why does anyone hide who they are? Because they fear discovery, because they have something worth keeping secret, or because... She paused, her knitting needles resuming their steady rhythm. Someone else has already found them out. The next morning, the postmistress's boy brought an unexpected delivery to the Swan, a plain brown envelope addressed simply to Mrs. Edith Weatherby, proprietor. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a typewritten message. You should have kept quiet about the man. Now it will be worse for you. There was no signature, no postmark. The envelope had been slipped under the door in the night. Mrs. Weatherby went white as chalk and sent for Sergeant Finch at once. Miss Marple arrived shortly after and examined the letter with delicate care. You see, Sergeant, she said softly, our culprit has grown frightened. Threats are a sign of desperation. Someone here in Little Daring is watching far too closely and doesn't realize how much they've already revealed. Finch looked at her in alarm. Revealed what, ma'am? Miss Marple folded the paper neatly. That our missing gentleman was not the first guest to disappear in Little Daring, only the first to be missed. The village of Little Daring, for all its modest charm, had never been so unsettled. Curtains twitched, voices dropped to whispers, and the good women at the parish tea behaved as though the devil himself had taken a room at the Swan. Miss Marple, however, went about her usual business, knitting, taking her morning walk, and paying what seemed the most harmless of visits. Each one, of course, chosen with deliberate care. Her first call was to Mr. Harding, the solicitor. She found him in his office above the ironmonger's, surrounded by neat stacks of papers and a faint smell of pipe tobacco. My dear Mr. Harding, she began pleasantly, I'm sure you must be weary of people questioning you about poor Mr. Alderney, but I had just one small query. He smiled thinly. By all means, Miss Marple. I've told the police everything I know. Of course. I merely wondered, did you happen to keep a record of Mrs. Weatherby's inheritance papers? I understand you advised her on them some weeks ago. Certainly I did. All in order. A distant cousin, nothing more. How efficient of you. I only ask because I recall something my nephew once said. He works in a solicitor's office himself. He told me that people who've inherited unexpectedly often receive, shall we say, unwanted attention from those who know more about their windfalls than they ought. Mr. Harding's fingers paused on his pen. Are you implying something, Miss Marple? Oh no, she said mildly. Merely observing how quickly news travels, especially when money is involved. His smile returned, but not his ease. As she left, she noticed a small detail on his desk. A fountain pen with a crack in its barrel, an identical make to the one Mrs. Weatherby said Mr. Brown had left behind. Her next stop was the post office, where Mrs. Dobbins was eager to share her newest theory. It's that Tom Bartlett boy, she confided in a whisper. You mark my words, Miss Marple, he's mixed up in something. The letter he delivered set all this in motion. Indeed, said Miss Marple kindly. Then perhaps he can help us after all. She found Tom later in the churchyard, cleaning the gravestones as part of his chores. His face went red when she mentioned the letter. I swear, Miss Marple, I didn't do nothing wrong. I just gave it to him like I always do. Of course you did, she said gently. But tell me, dear, when you handed it to him, did you notice anything else? Anything strange about his hands, perhaps? Tom frowned, thinking. Well, now that you say it, yes. He had a bandage round his right hand. Looked fresh, like he'd burned it. Burned it? Yes, ma'am. I asked if he'd had an accident, but he just laughed and said, it's from lighting the fire too often. Funny thing was, there weren't no fire lit in his room that night. Miss Marple nodded slowly. A curious remark indeed. Thank you, Thomas. You've been most helpful. That evening brought another visit, this time from Inspector Lyle, clearly irritated. We've traced the handwriting on that note Mrs. Weatherby received, Miss Marple. Not the typewriter, the envelope. It's Mrs. Weatherby's own stationery. The note must have been written here. How very bold, said Miss Marple. Or stupid. But she swears she had no idea. Says she keeps her writing paper in a drawer behind the bar. And here's the best part. Someone took one sheet and left the drawer unlocked. Which suggests, said Miss Marple quietly, that whoever wrote the note was in this house recently and wanted her to think the threat came from outside. Lyle sighed. We're chasing shadows. It's like the man vanished into thin air. Miss Marple's expression softened. People don't vanish, Inspector. They're concealed, either by fear, by loyalty, or by someone else's convenience. That same night, a storm rolled in over Little Daring. The wind rattled the shutters of the Swan and rain hammered on the thatch. Mrs. Weatherby, unable to sleep, went down to the parlor for a cup of tea and froze. A figure was standing at the back door, coat drenched, face half hidden by the dark. Mrs. Weatherby, the man said hoarsely, you must listen to me. She screamed before he could finish. Within minutes, half the village was awake, and Sergeant Finch had burst into the inn, revolver drawn. But the man was gone. Only the muddy prints remained, leading not out of the inn but upstairs toward the guest rooms. The next morning, Miss Marple stood in the narrow hallway where the footprints ended, just outside room 3. Whoever came last night, she said softly, did not come to frighten Mrs. Weatherby. He came to fetch something he'd left behind. Inspector Lyle frowned. But what? We searched the room from floor to ceiling. Miss Marple bent down, fingers brushing the edge of the skirting board. Not quite from ceiling to floor, Inspector. Look here. She pulled gently and a loose section of paneling came away, revealing a hollow space behind it. Inside lay a small leather-bound book. Not the notebook this time, but a ledger wrapped in oilcloth. The same word that had been faintly indented in Mr. Alderney's notebook. Lyle opened it carefully. The first few pages were filled with neat columns of figures, names, dates, and sums of money. Mrs. Weatherby gasped. Those are accounts from my late husband's business, but there are entries here I've never seen before. Money paid to people in Little Daring under false names. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. Ah, so our missing guest was no stranger after all. He came to find the ledger, and someone else came to make sure he never took it away. Inspector Lyle looked grim. You mean Harding? Perhaps, said Miss Marple. Or someone who feared what the ledger revealed. You see, Inspector, in my experience, money rarely travels alone. It brings with it deceit, vanity, and sometimes murder. That afternoon, Harding was summoned to the Swan for questioning. As he entered, he caught sight of the ledger on the table and froze. His confident manner vanished. I can explain that, he stammered. Miss Marple's knitting paused mid-stitch. Of course you can, Mr. Harding. Everyone can when the truth is close enough to touch. But her tone, soft as it was, carried something final beneath it, like the click of a closing lock. The arrest of Mr. Harding caused quite the sensation in Little Daring. For a day or two, the village breathed easier, though not with comfort, exactly. There was a sense of nervous relief, as though the unpleasant business had been tidied away, but might at any moment spring open again like an unlatched box. At the Swan, business resumed, though the laughter was forced and the fire seemed to burn a little colder. Mrs. Weatherby, pale but resolute, kept her post behind the counter. We must carry on, Miss Marple, she said. The living mustn't let the dead steal their peace. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Quite right, my dear. But peace built on a misunderstanding seldom lasts long. That evening, Miss Marple sat in her usual armchair near the hearth, knitting in hand, while Inspector Lyle reviewed his notes across from her. So, to sum it up, he said, Harding had motive. He handled Mrs. Weatherby's finances, had access to her papers, and knew about the hidden ledger. He likely realized Alderney, or whoever he was, meant to expose him. So he killed the man, wrote that threatening note to mislead Mrs. Weatherby, and tried to retrieve the ledger himself. Clean, tidy, and motive-driven. Yes, said Miss Marple thoughtfully. Very tidy indeed. Almost too tidy, wouldn't you say? Lyle frowned. You mean you're not convinced? Let us say, Miss Marple said mildly, that I have seen too many tidy explanations unravel in the wash. There's something missing, Inspector. Something that doesn't breathe. Breathe? Humanly, I mean. There's no emotion behind it. Mr. Harding is cautious, yes, but he's also vain. Men of his sort like to be admired, not feared. Killing would be a dreadful blemish on his self-image. Then who in heaven's name do you suspect? Miss Marple didn't answer. She simply said, Tell me, Inspector, did anyone verify Mr. Alderney's identity properly? Why, yes. The inn ledger lists him as Mr. Charles Alderney of London. Arrived on Tuesday last alone, paid for a week in advance, left no luggage, claimed it was being sent later. Ah, said Miss Marple softly. And did it arrive? No. We assumed it was delayed. She leaned forward slightly. You see, Inspector, one can claim to be anyone when one arrives without luggage. The next morning brought proof of that very idea. A telegram arrived from London in response to Lyle's inquiry to the address Mr. Alderney had given. It read simply, No such person known. Mr. Charles Alderney died 3 years ago. The inspector swore under his breath. Then who the devil was our guest? Precisely, said Miss Marple. She rose, crossed the parlor, and picked up the cracked fountain pen Mrs. Weatherby had kept aside from room 3. I believe, Inspector, that this is the only honest thing our false guest left behind. How so? She turned it over, examining the silver tip. The initials are not CA, but CLA, do you see? That second letter has been scratched to resemble an A, but it was once an L. Lyle's eyes widened. You're saying, yes, our Mr. Alderney was no Alderney at all. I suspect he was Christopher Lane Alderney's younger brother, Lawrence, long thought dead abroad, or at least that's what the gossip pages once said. And he came here not to hide, but to claim something that belonged to him. Inspector Lyle rubbed his temples. So he impersonates his brother, comes to this sleepy village, digs up a ledger full of dirty accounts, and ends up murdered. And now Harding's our wrong man. Miss Marple nodded gently. Oh, quite wrong, and I fancy someone in this very house knows it. Her gaze drifted to the staircase. At that very moment, a door creaked above, and Mrs. Weatherby's maid, Lucy, came down with a tray of tea. She was pale, her hands trembling slightly as she set down the cups. You look unwell, my dear, Miss Marple said kindly. Lucy's voice shook. It's just the weather, ma'am. Storms make me nervous. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Indeed, storms do tend to unsettle the guilty. The girl froze, teacup in hand, as though struck by lightning. Before either of them could speak, a sharp knock came at the door. Sergeant Finch burst in, hat dripping rain. Inspector, we've found something by the riverbank near the mill. Lyle stood at once. What is it? A coat, sir, man's coat. And inside there's blood, and a hotel key from the Swan. Room 3. Within the hour, the soaked garment was laid out on the table. It was the same dark overcoat the stranger had worn, but the pockets told a new story. Inside were 2 train tickets, one to Little Daring, and one from, both purchased under the name Lawrence Alderney, and tucked within a side pocket, a small photograph, the edges worn. It showed Mrs. Weatherby, younger and smiling, standing beside a man who could only be Lawrence himself. Inspector Lyle looked thunderstruck. Then she knew him. Oh yes, Miss Marple said quietly, better than she cared to admit. That evening, Miss Marple visited Mrs. Weatherby alone. The landlady was sitting rigid in her parlor, hands clasped in her lap, the storm outside echoing faintly through the windows. You should have told us you knew him, my dear, Miss Marple said softly. It would have saved you quite a bit of fear." Mrs. Weatherby's eyes filled with tears. "I was ashamed. Lawrence Alderney. He was my fiancé once, before my marriage. We quarreled, he left for Africa, and I never heard from him again. Then last week he appeared here claiming he'd come into money and wanted to make amends. He said he had proof my late husband had swindled him years ago." Miss Marple listened without interruption, her face unreadable. "But," Mrs. Weatherby went on, "the next morning, he was gone. I swear, Miss Marple, I didn't harm him." "I believe you," Miss Marple said, "but someone else did, and that someone feared what he might tell you. The ledger was never his goal, you see. It was yours." Just then, a shadow crossed the window. A knock followed. "Inspector Lyle!" cried Mrs. Weatherby. But Miss Marple shook her head. "No, that won't be the inspector. He has more sense than to walk in this weather without his coat." She rose slowly, her knitting still in one hand. Outside, lightning flashed, and for a split second the figure at the glass was visible. Not Lyle, but Mr. Harding, pale and desperate, his eyes wide with fear. He had escaped custody, and he wasn't alone. Behind him another shape moved, someone familiar holding a lantern. Miss Marple's lips tightened. "Ah," she whispered. "So the storm has finally brought them all together." The storm raged through the night, shaking the old timbers of the Swan Inn. Thunder rolled over Little Daring like a warning from the heavens, while inside tension crackled sharper than the lightning outside. By morning, the rain had eased to a mist, but the village awoke to startling news. Mr. Harding had escaped custody. The constable's bicycle found abandoned near the mill. Rumors spread like wildfire, that Harding had fled to London, that he'd drowned himself, that he'd come back for Mrs. Weatherby. Every theory had its believers, and every believer had a story to tell. Miss Marple, meanwhile, sat at her usual breakfast table with her knitting bag, appearing as tranquil as a church pew. Yet her mind was anything but idle. She had watched fear take root in Mrs. Weatherby's eyes. She had seen Lucy the maid grow pale whenever Harding's name was spoken. And she had noted how Inspector Lyle, despite his gruff confidence, seemed a man increasingly uneasy with the simplicity of his own conclusions. A pattern was forming. She only needed to tighten the last thread. Late that afternoon, Miss Marple asked for a word with the inspector. "Inspector," she said mildly, "it occurs to me that we've been chasing a man, when perhaps we ought to have been chasing a moment." Lyle blinked. "A moment?" "Yes, the precise moment when the murder occurred. You see, everyone assumes our guest was killed that night, because he was seen at supper and not the next morning. But what if the death occurred later? Or earlier?" Lyle frowned. "Earlier?" But Mrs. Weatherby spoke with him that evening. Indeed she did. Or thought she did. But with the lamps low and the storm gathering, one could mistake a shadow for a man, and a frightened maid might repeat what she was told to say. "Are you implying Lucy lied?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "I never said that, Inspector. But frightened people sometimes see what others need them to see, and fear is a curious thing. It leaves fingerprints no dusting powder ever can. That evening, Miss Marple asked Mrs. Weatherby if she might hold a small gathering in the parlor. "For the sake of clarity," she said. Mrs. Weatherby, exhausted and trembling, agreed. The guests were few: Mrs. Weatherby, Inspector Lyle, Lucy the maid, Sergeant Finch, and a single constable posted by the back door. A chair was left conspicuously empty by the fire. The chair once occupied by Mr. Alderney, or Lawrence, as he truly was. "I thought it only right," Miss Marple explained gently, "to leave a place for our missing guest. After all, this is the Swan Inn, and he did pay for his stay in advance." The others exchanged uneasy glances. Outside, the wind moaned softly through the chimney. Miss Marple continued in her mild, conversational tone. "Now, Mr. Harding's escape has caused a great deal of worry, but it may interest you to know, Inspector, that he came to see me this morning." Lyle nearly dropped his notebook. "He what?" "Oh, yes. He arrived at dawn, soaked and shivering. I gave him tea, of course. He assured me he had no hand in Lawrence Alderney's death, and, curiously, I believed him." Lucy let out a gasp. Mrs. Weatherby's hand trembled against her teacup. Miss Marple went on. He told me something quite revealing. That on the night before Lawrence disappeared, a second visitor came to the Swan. Someone who claimed to have a message for him. A woman. Inspector Lyle's head jerked up. A woman? Yes, said Miss Marple softly. She came by the side entrance, not the front, wearing a cloak with the hood pulled up. Mr. Harding saw her from the lane when he was passing by. She entered quietly, but she left in haste, and after that, Lawrence Alderney was never seen again. There was a long, strained silence. Then, Lucy burst out. It wasn't her fault. She didn't mean to. Oh, please, Miss Marple, don't. Mrs. Weatherby rose sharply. Lucy, stop. But the girl was crying now, her words tumbling out like stones. He said he'd ruin her, ma'am. He said he'd show everyone what your husband did. What you'd done to help him hide the money. She only meant to frighten him. She didn't know he'd fall. Lyle leapt to his feet. Fall? You mean Alderney's death was an accident? Lucy sobbed harder. He grabbed her arm, she pushed him away, and he stumbled down the cellar steps. He hit his head. She screamed for me to help, and we hit him. Oh, ma'am, I begged her to tell the police, but she said it would ruin us both. All eyes turned to Mrs. Weatherby. Her face was deathly pale, her lips trembling. Yes, she whispered finally. It's true. He came that night, angry, half-drunk. He said my husband had cheated him and that I was living on stolen money. I tried to reason with him, but he wouldn't listen. He took my arm hard and She covered her face with her hands. I shoved him. He fell. It was over in a second. Oh, God forgive me. Inspector Lyle stood frozen for a moment, then exhaled slowly. So that's it. Not murder planned, but panic. Fear and foolishness, Miss Marple nodded gently. Yes, fear and the desire to keep up appearances. The most dangerous motive of all in a small village. Lucy sobbed quietly. Mrs. Weatherby looked broken but strangely relieved, as though a weight had at last lifted from her shoulders. Miss Marple reached over and patted her hand. I am very sorry, my dear, but truth once buried has a way of finding its way to the surface, rather like a body in a stream. Lyle, though stern, softened his tone. We'll need a full statement, Mrs. Weatherby, but I'll see it handled with discretion. Miss Marple rose. And perhaps, Inspector, when you do, you'll remember that this poor woman's worst crime was pride and silence. Outside, the rain had stopped completely. The village lay quiet beneath a pale dawn. Miss Marple stood by the inn window watching the first light touch the wet cobblestones. Curious creatures, humans, she murmured. Always so eager to hide what they think shameful, even when confession would save them. It never changes, not in St. Mary Mead nor Little Daring, nor anywhere else. She picked up her knitting bag, looped the wool neatly, and smiled faintly to herself. Still, she added softly, a little truth once spoken can be the kindest mercy of all. Morning broke clear and cold over Little Daring. The storm had spent itself, leaving the village washed and glistening, the air sharp with the scent of wet earth. At the Swan Inn, the parlor looked almost peaceful again. The fire burned steadily, the tables neatly set for breakfast as if no shadow had ever passed through the room. Only the faint hush of lowered voices and the absence of Mrs. Weatherby behind the counter betrayed what had taken place the night before. Inspector Lyle sat at the table nearest the hearth, his notebook closed before him, staring into the flames. Miss Marple, across from him, poured tea with her usual serenity. Well, Miss Marple, he said at last, I must admit I never saw it. Not for all the world. I thought Harding the villain, then the stranger, never once considered our poor landlady. Miss Marple smiled faintly. That is because, Inspector, Mrs. Weatherby is a respectable woman. And in a village such as ours, respectability can be the most effective disguise of all. Lyle leaned forward. Tell me then, if you please, how did you come to suspect her? From the beginning, I mean. Miss Marple set down her cup. From the beginning? Well, it was the teacups, I suppose. The teacups, oh yes. You see, when you first examined the table in Mr. Alderney's room, there were 2 cups. One used, one untouched. Everyone assumed he'd ordered tea for one and left the other unpoured. But Mrs. Weatherby herself carried that tray up, did she not? And Mrs. Weatherby, as I've observed, never wastes. If she brought 2 cups, she expected company. Lyle blinked. So she went to his room willingly. Precisely. And that led me to wonder why she was so eager to believe he was a stranger. Why she didn't question his story, his lack of luggage, or his false name. In truth, she knew him the moment she saw him. Miss Marple leaned back, her knitting needles clicking softly. Then there was the note. You'll recall, Inspector, that it was typed on her own paper and placed where she would find it. That was no outside threat. It was meant to frighten her into silence. I suspect she wrote it herself when the guilt became too heavy to bear. The inspector frowned thoughtfully. And the ledger? Where does that fit? The ledger. That was the root of everything. Mr. Weatherby's old account book full of irregular payments and false names. Lawrence Alderney, her former fiancé, must have come upon it somehow. Perhaps through Harding, perhaps by chance. He realized he'd been cheated years ago by her late husband and came here to confront her. She feared exposure, perhaps even believed she'd lose the inn, her reputation, everything. In that panic, she met him privately, meaning only to reason with him. Miss Marple's tone softened. But quarrels have a way of turning bitter when the past is involved. He caught her arm. She pushed him. He fell. A dreadful accident, but she panicked, hid the body in the cellar, and sought Lucy's help to carry it down to the river that night when the storm broke. Lyle's pen hovered above his notebook. The river carried him off. That's why we found no trace. Exactly. But guilt has a way of leaving small, untidy things behind. The missing pen, the borrowed ledger, the false story about the note. All little ripples on the surface. Lyle sat back, exhaling. So simple when one sees it laid out. And yet, devilish hard to see before. Miss Marple smiled. The simplest crimes often are. Especially when they grow from emotion, not malice. He gave her a long look. You mean to tell me you feel sorry for her? I do, Inspector, said Miss Marple quietly. She has suffered enough. And remember, were it not for her fear of gossip, she might have confessed that very night. It was pride that killed Lawrence Alderney as much as any fall. Lyle nodded slowly. Pride and silence, two old sins that never go out of fashion. A knock sounded at the door. Sergeant Finch entered, cap in hand. Excuse me, sir. The magistrate's orders have come through. Mrs. Weatherby's to be charged with manslaughter, but they're recommending leniency. Quite right, said Lyle. There's no sense in making a public spectacle. When Finch had gone, Miss Marple rose, smoothing her skirt. Well, Inspector, I must say you've handled this with admirable restraint. He gave a small, weary smile. Truth be told, I'd rather handle a dozen burglars than one case like this. There's too much heartache in it. Indeed, said Miss Marple gently. One can almost feel sorry for the murderer, and that, I think, is when one has understood the case truly. Outside, the bells of St. Stephen's began to ring for morning prayers. Miss Marple stood at the window, looking out over the glistening rooftops and quiet street. Do you know, Inspector, she said after a moment, this reminds me of a case once in St. Mary Mead. A gardener there, Mr. Lister, killed a man who discovered he'd been poaching from the estate. A dreadful thing, but entirely due to pride. The poor man could not bear to lose his good name. It seems to me people will do almost anything rather than have their neighbors look at them differently. Lyle chuckled softly. You've seen too much of human nature, Miss Marple. She smiled. Oh, one can never see too much of that. It's endlessly instructive. That afternoon, as Miss Marple prepared to leave Little Daring, several villagers gathered to see her off at the coach stop. Mrs. Dobbins from the post office brought her a parcel of scones. Young Tom Bartlett shyly handed her a wildflower he'd picked by the mill. Thank you, my dears, she said warmly. I shall think of you all when I have my tea in St. Mary Mead. Though I do hope your next guest at the Swan will stay the full week and check out properly. They laughed softly, the tension finally broken. And as the coach pulled away, Miss Marple sat back against the seat, watching the quiet village recede behind her. Another story concluded. Another tragedy tidied up as neatly as her knitting bag, but her eyes, bright and thoughtful, still lingered on the image of the old inn, its windows shining in the pale light, hiding all that had happened within. Such dear, foolish people, she murmured. Always so certain evil comes from outside, when it so often lives right at home. The village of Little Daring settled back into its routines with the cautious quiet that follows any scandal. The papers called it the Swan Inn affair, though few beyond the parish boundaries read much about it. The coroner's inquest was discreet. The verdict? Death by misadventure. Mrs. Weatherby, pale and trembling, was sent to stay with a sister in Devon until her health improved. Lucy, who had wept bitterly through every hearing, was allowed to remain at the inn under supervision. She took to wearing black for a time, though no one quite knew for whom. The regulars, Mr. Tulliver, Mrs. Dobbins, old Major Phipps, continued to meet in the parlor each evening. But their talk was softer now, their laughter brief. For many, weeks, a hush seemed to settle over the room whenever the rain began to fall or the door creaked open unexpectedly. Miss Marple returned to St. Mary Mead not long after the inquest. She unpacked quietly, watered her geraniums, and wrote a brief letter to the vicar's wife. "My dear Griselda, you will, I think, find this case rather a study in the dangers of concealment." Mrs. Weatherby meant no harm, but she allowed the fear of public opinion to rule her conscience. And that, as I have observed, is quite as dangerous as any wicked intent. Yours affectionately, Jane Marple. A week later, her dear friend Dolly Bantry dropped by for tea and gossip, as she always did when there had been a little excitement abroad. "Well, Jane," she said, settling into her chair, "you must tell me everything. I read the account in the paper, but I don't believe half of it. Fancy that quiet woman, Mrs. Weatherby, turning out a killer. You might have knocked me over with a feather." Miss Marple smiled, stirring her tea. "People are never quite what they seem, Dolly. You should know that by now." "Oh, I do. But I'd have sworn she was harmless as milk." "Milk can turn sour, my dear," said Miss Marple gently, "especially when kept too long in the dark." Dolly laughed, but there was a shiver behind it. "You do have a way of putting things." For a time, the two women sat in companionable silence. Outside, a robin hopped along the garden wall. The world seemed very peaceful, but Miss Marple's thoughts were elsewhere. On a stormy night, a frightened woman, and a man who had come too late to forgive. It was not hatred that had killed him, she reflected, not greed, nor jealousy, just that quiet, fatal fear of being found out. How many crimes, she wondered, had begun not in wickedness but in panic? Later, as she drew her curtains and settled by the fire with her knitting, she murmured softly to herself, "People imagine evil as something grand and dramatic. A dagger, a secret poison, a plot. But it's seldom that. More often it's the little lie, the small silence, the moment of pride that shuts a mouth when it ought to open." She looked into the fire, her needles clicking gently. "And then," she added, "one must live with the ashes." Outside, the church clock struck 9. St. Mary Mead lay still under the stars, as tranquil as any English village could be. Yet somewhere beyond its hedges another small story was already beginning, one that before long would find its way to Miss Marple's doorstep, disguised in all its innocence, for wickedness, she knew, never rested long. It only waited, politely, patiently, until someone offered it tea. What did you think of Miss Marple's final reveal? Did you suspect the truth before she did? Comment your theory below, and if you enjoyed the mystery, make sure to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for the next story. Because in every quiet village, something dark always stirs.